Hey, wake up! It's Means Morning News. Just after 11 a.m. on the East Coast, I'm Sam Sachs. It's the Friday show. And here are today's stories, as told to me by a voice in a conch shell I found the other day. And we begin in Gaza, where the possibility of hundreds of thousands of kids starving to death is now finally moving some world leaders to do the bare minimum: issue statements of condemnation. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney tweeted out condemnation of Israel's denial of humanitarian aid to Gaza. Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese also released a statement condemning Israel's starvation campaign. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer called what Israel is doing to Gaza a, quote, human catastrophe. And France announced it would take the step of recognizing Palestinian statehood. Even Hillary Clinton, who oversaw the butchering of Libya, put out a tweet expressing concern about starvation deaths and calling for aid to be let in to Gaza. More and more lawmakers in Washington are speaking out against Israel, even among some of the apartheid state's staunchest supporters, like Rep. Dan Goldman, who called Israel's denial of aid to Gaza, quote, unacceptable. What we're seeing is a scramble among powerful people today to speak out only now against an atrocity that's been going on for nearly 2 years, so as to look like they've always been opposed to it, lest they be considered a monster in the eyes of history. This shock to the conscience, however, has not reached the White House. Members of the administration actually criticized France on Thursday for coming out in support of Palestinian statehood. Secretary of State Marco Rubio called it reckless. And Trump's top negotiator in the region, real estate developer Steve Witkoff, broke off peace talks with Hamas this week. Israeli negotiators are under the sway of the far-right war government that wants to intensify the extermination campaign in Gaza. It's why the Israeli so-called ceasefire proposal includes keeping large amounts of troops in Gaza, building a concentration camp to detain Palestinians, and only allowing aid to be delivered through the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation mechanism, which has killed over 1,000 Palestinians since May. Hamas put forward their counter-proposal that would have worked toward a permanent ceasefire and allow the free flow of aid to resume into Gaza, but U.S. and Israeli negotiators rejected it and immediately abandoned the talks in Doha. Witkoff blamed the collapse in talks on Hamas, a lie intended to provide more cover to the Israeli genocide campaign. Next up, back to Washington, D.C., a new story about the Trump administration protecting pedophiles. And it doesn't even involve Jeffrey Epstein. This time, the White House worked with the Catholic Church to block enforcement of a law in Washington state that required clergy to report child sexual abuse. Federal judge put the law on hold last week, finding that it likely violates the church's religious freedom to keep pedophilia under wraps, I guess. Actually, in most states in the country, members of the church don't have to report someone who admits to abusing kids, as long as that admission is made during a confessional. Washington was set to join 6 states that closed that loophole, including some very conservative religious states like New Hampshire, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Rhode Island, West Virginia, and Texas, which is currently in court defending a new law to put the 10 Commandments up in public schools. But those states could be the high watermark with the fanatics that occupy all 3 branches of government now. Trump's Department of Justice joined the suit against the law in Washington, which was first brought by the Archdiocese of Seattle. Lawyers for Attorney General Pam Bondi, who's currently suppressing the release of Epstein files that likely incriminate her boss, the president, claimed in a court filing that the law, quote, deprives Catholic priests of their fundamental right to freely exercise their religious beliefs. Now, virtually all other professions, including those that normally operate under strict confidentiality arrangements, must abide by reporting requirements when they learn of child sexual abuse. Some people could be compelled to testify and turn over evidence. In the case of the Washington state law, clergy would not be forced to testify or turn over notes or anything, just to inform authorities within 48 hours. You know, I'm not sure it's really a good idea to entrust, of all institutions, the Catholic freaking Church with an exemption to reporting child sexual abuse. In fact, it might be the worst institution to grant that exemption to. There's a lot of kooky stuff in the Bible and some old customs that are not followed anymore because they're oppressive, antisocial, and undermine a free, liberal society. And maybe, just maybe, priest pedophile privilege should be the next to go. And finally, sometimes you have this notion in your brain and then actual data is presented and it totally undermines what you previously thought. Yeah, this is not one of those times. New research shows that a 4-day work week is very good for workers' well-being. The study was published in the journal Nature and is based on the most comprehensive analysis of 4-day workweek arrangements around the world, including the US, Ireland, and New Zealand. Nearly 3,000 workers were analyzed, and here's what the researchers found. Quote, analysis of pre- and post-trial data shows improvements in burnout, job satisfaction, mental health, and physical health, a pattern not observed in 12 control companies. The results indicate that income-preserving 4-day work weeks are an effective organizational intervention for enhancing workers' well-being. Specifically, people who switched to an income-preserving 4-day work week reported increased job satisfaction, workability, and increased exercise. And at the same time, they reported a decrease in sleep problems and fatigue. So this seems like a no-brainer policy that would still allow capitalists to be profitable while also improving the lives of workers. A sensible country would take this data into account and implement labor policy to achieve this. Here, though, we're ruled by demons. When President Trump's so-called Big Beautiful Bill was being crafted, a provision was put inside that blocked states from regulating AI companies for the next decade. Remember that? The House passed the bill in a rush because Trump wanted it all done by July 4th, so no one actually read what was inside it. It was only after that the big tech giveaway hit the news and lawmakers got an earful about how bad this provision was. Rep. Marjorie Taylor Greene said she'd vote against the bill if it came before the House again with that AI measure, thus admitting she didn't read the bill the first time it came before the House with the AI measure. Well, the Senate went on to strip out the deregulation measure in a 99-1 vote, and it never returned to the final version of the bill. So states are still free to regulate AI industries operating within their jurisdictions. For now, at least, because the White House just proposed other ways to shield big tech AI lords from local regulation. The administration put out its AI action plan this week. Among the proposals, punishing states that regulate AI, including denying federal funding and contracts to them. It's literally in the first pillar of the first section of the action plan. Quote, led by the Office of Management and Budget, federal agencies that have AI-related discretionary funding programs must ensure, consistent with applicable law, that they consider a state's AI regulatory climate when making funding decisions and limit funding if the state's AI regulatory regimes may hinder the effectiveness of that funding or award. Well, all that's going to do is encourage states to engage in a deregulatory race to the bottom, sacrificing their residents to the externalities caused by data center infrastructure, which is an extremely high-polluting and resource-intensive industry. In places where AI data centers go up, energy prices go up too, because these things consume as much power as entire cities do. Another thing of note in the White House's AI action plan, it's completely unserious when it comes to addressing mass job losses caused by capitalists using AI to cut labor costs, which is ultimately the entire point of this whole enterprise. The document does include this passage, quote, led by the Department of Labor, leverage available discretionary funding where appropriate to fund rapid retraining for individuals impacted by AI-related job displacement. Oh, so the federal government, through the Department of Labor, is going to fund job training and relocation services for workers displaced by AI? Well, I'm curious how that's going to work, since at the same time, the Department of Labor proposed gutting its job retraining programs for next year's budget. Yeah, in fact, the Labor Secretary, Lori Chavez-DeRemer, proposed eliminating all retraining programs, including the ones that specifically address workers displaced by AI, and instead replacing them with block grants to states to spend the money how they see fit. Ultimately, the proposal amounts to a $39 million cut to the department's Labor and Training Administration from last year. So don't let these guys fool you. Workers will be hurt most by an unleashed AI industry, and this action plan says we're on our own. And that also includes artists. There's no mention in the action plan about how people's intellectual property will be safeguarded from being fed into a learning model and used to generate some Netflix slop or something. There is a line, however, in there about ensuring the protection of AI companies' intellectual property. That effort will be led by the Pentagon, the intelligence community, and the dang Department of Homeland Security. Hey, look at that. We made it to Friday, and it's time for Rich Dicks. I wanted to highlight one very strong nomination we received on Blue Sky for Hulk Hogan. Yeah, the Hulkster died this week at 71, and while to the masses he'll be known as one of the most famous professional wrestlers of all time, to many of his brothers in the ring, he'll be known as a union buster. Hogan conspired with Vince McMahon to crush an organizing campaign led by Jesse Ventura. Hogan also played the role of Peter Thiel's pawn, used to sue Gawker into oblivion and shutter the news outlet because Thiel and Hogan didn't like their reporting. All that stuff aside, it was also a sad end for the once prolific entertainer. His latest, most notable performance was at the Republican National Convention, ripping his shirt off for Donald Trump. Hogan also spent his final months traveling to various gas stations around the country and hawking his new beer brand. Embarrassing. If there's an afterlife, I hope he's getting a flying elbow from Macho Man Randy Savage forever. Okay, enough on that. Time for the main entree. This week's Rich Dick is Starbucks CEO Brian Niccol. The AFL-CIO released its latest Executive Pay Watch report, tracking the wage gap between CEOs at a company and their average workers. And the union found that in 2024, on average, CEOs were compensated 285 times higher than their workers were. CEO pay has increased considerably over the past decade at a much faster rate than workers' wages. All that is bad enough. But it's also just an average, meaning there are outlier cases, including extreme outlier cases, like at Starbucks, where Mr. Nickel took home a mind-boggling 6,666 times more pay than the average barista at the company, despite that guy not making a single coffee all year for a customer. According to the union's report, Nickel received $97,813,843 in annualized total compensation in 2024. That includes salary, bonuses, and stocks. As the union noted, quote, the median Starbucks worker would have had to start working for Starbucks in 4,643 BC during the Stone Age just to earn what Starbucks CEO earned in 2024 alone. Yeah, not a great look for a guy who refuses to increase wages and provide a fair labor contract to the 600 plus cafes and 12,000 plus workers who've unionized at Starbucks over the last few years. When Nickel took over as CEO last year, he claimed he respected workers' rights to unionize and he was committed to collective bargaining. Yet here we are about a year later, and no damn contract. In April, unionized baristas rejected an offer from the company that only put forward a meager pay raise of 2% a year. Instead of a contract, Nickel instituted a new rule to require already overworked and understaffed baristas to ensure they deliver customers' orders in less than 4 minutes. And he said management was going to be, quote, maniacal about it. This really is to be expected from Nickel, who is notorious for union busting at his old job too, as CEO of Chipotle. Under his watch there, the company settled 2 cases related to illegal union busting. One store in Augusta, Maine was closed down just as workers had reached a threshold to unionize. The NLRB forced Chipotle to pay those workers at the store nearly $250,000 to settle the charges of illegal union busting. Just this week, workers at a Starbucks in Disney, Los Angeles, walked off the job to protest management issues and Nickel's refusal to bargain in good faith with the union. Starbucks Workers United posted this message on Twitter sharing the AFL-CIO's pay report. Quote, Starbucks CEO Brian Nickel made 6,666 times more than the typical Starbucks worker, all while baristas are not able to pay their rent and bills or get the hours they need to qualify for health care. This company can afford fair union contracts. No more excuses, Brian. That's right. See you at the bargaining table, bitch. Brian Nickel, this week's Rich Dick. All right, friends, the show ends today with a sunrise from Mexico. It was sent in by Erin from Playas de Rosarito in Baja, California. Enjoy. Thank you, Erin. That's the show. Thanks for watching, and thanks to the team behind the scenes. Find more MMN at means.tv. We also have a YouTube and a podcast channel, and you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky. One day, capitalism will fall. I promise it will. But until then, we're going to be right here. See you next week.